Good evening. Tonight we begin with a tale colder than any lullaby. Cyanide. This tiny, merciless spectre once lurked in the shadows of courtrooms, dungeons and corridors of power. Forget those glossy spy thrillers. Here there are no elegant files, nor dramatic last words. The true tale of cyanide is far darker, more bureaucratic, and shockingly mundane. The truth is, if you find yourself in its silent domain, you may not last a single day. Where cyanide lurks, both life and power may change at terrifying speed. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're from, and what time it is where you are. I've always been fascinated by the diverse backgrounds of our global audience. Now please dim the lights, and let us step into tonight's tale of shadow. In an early 18th century Berlin workshop, a craftsman's accidental mishap during routine work gave birth to a color unprecedented on the European continent, that profound and eternal blue, which tailors dyes, painters palettas, and porcelain glazes all vied to possess. Chemists would later marvel at this hue, dubbed Prussian blue, whose very birth was steeped in drama. As Johann Jacob Desbach handled iron salts and alkali solutions, an accidental reagent spill or contaminated vessel yielded an indelible precipitate, cheaper than natural indigo, more intense than ultramarine. It swiftly conquered Europe's visual realm. Artists were captivated, armies were captivated, merchants were captivated. Beauty, as ever, commands attention, yet attention begets inquiry. Beauty carries its own consequences. This one, salon-hued, blue adorning military uniforms, was also a locked treasure chest, a puzzle the chemical world urgently sought to unlock. For decades, the pigment's composition eased the curious. They cut it with acid, tormented it with heat. It was not simple iron oxide nor common dye, but a coordination compound of iron with carbon and nitrogen units. Later, it evolved into an independent entity bearing ominous properties. Modern chemists approach it with the caution reserved for novel substances, meticulously dissecting, cautiously sniffing, yet with a touch of mischief. When the laboratory's acid scalpel cuts into the pigment, it distills a volatile, thin liquid. Its odor is pungent, bitter like the kernel of certain nuts, and carries an undeniable whiff of danger. Swedish alchemist and chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, the scholar, who operated private laboratories first in Kjellberg and later in Uppsala, was precisely the sort to dissect the ordinary in pursuit of the extraordinary. He habitually reduced pigments and salts to their essence. In the 1782, he began treating this mysterious blue substance with acid and heat. In 1782, he described a substance named pyridic acid, a designation linking this newly discovered volatile product to its chromophore origin. In his notes he recorded, with a chemist's meticulous observational language, the color is liquid, releasing pungent vapors, exuding an odor termed bitter almond, whose effect on living organisms differed markedly from substances like arsenic or arsenic acid. Hiller's account brims with both wonder and latent caution. What he isolated was precisely what we now call hydrogen cyanide HCN, yet he named it after its source, Prussian blue acid, the acid of Prussian blue. Naming proved crucial. The story of Prussian blue acid is also one of how language shapes discovery. 2 generations of chemists called it Prussian blue acid, or, in German, BLOCR, blue acid, for it was through this peculiar iron cyanide pigment that the compound first captured humanity's attention. Later, as systematic chemical nomenclature matured, the substance's naming shifted from national origin to etymology. The Greek term for deep blue, konuis, was invoked, from kyanos, derived, iron forming the austere syllable now employed by generals, forensic scientists and historians alike. Cyanide. This etymological journey harbors a silent irony, a lexicon built upon beautiful hues, has become synonymous with instant obliteration. Chemists following Hillen ever ceased their work. They decomposed acids into radicals and salts, revealing this volatile molecule exists both as HCN within chemical bonds and as CN in ionic form. Yet this simple pairing assumes myriad disguises, endowing cyan with its menacing carbon-nitrogen ripple bond, essentially a fusion of geometry and concealment. The linear triple bond lacks one carbon atom, while the nitrogen craves shared electrons. In many ways it behaves like a pseudo-halide, serving as the skeleton for stable transition metal complexes, and the core of volatile toxic agents. In timber and soil, under the alchemist's skilled hand, it may prove beneficial or deadly. When scientists discerned its dual nature, the gaseous parent HCN and the cyanide ion CN, industrial curiosity arose. HCN is a minute, volatile molecule, a faintly almond-scented gas at room temperature, perceived by only a fraction of individuals. This sensory characteristic renders reliable early warning systems challenging. In air, it disperses and migrates in water. Its equilibrium tests with its ionic form. Acid-base equilibrium dictates its behavior, as hydrogen cyanide is a weak acid. Within physiological pH environments, the majority persists as HCN. Only a minute proportion exists as CN ions in blood. Yet this minute proportion exhibits disproportionate lethality. Being uncharged, HCN easily penetrates biological membranes. Upon entering the aqueous interior of cells, local chemical conditions drive its cyanidation. Here cyanide ions encounter metal centers with specific affinity. In industrial applications, cyanide compounds manifest in multiple forms. Their salt forms appear as brittle white crystals, such as sodium cyanide and potassium cyanide. These substances remain stable in dry conditions and have been extensively utilized by miners and metallurgical workers for centuries. Another form folds into complex ions like ferritinamide, where iron elements bind the cyanide group within a seemingly innocuous lattice structure. Prussian blue itself is an iron-bound cyanide compound, whose stability derives from the cage-like encapsulation of the metal center. Yet, even stable complexes can release volatile derivatives under specific condition. Following acidification, an almond-like bitterness permeates the air. Its chemical properties are remarkably diverse. The same cyanide structure appears in organic chemistry as nitro groups, from nitrobenzene used as a solvent to benzene, nitrile and others emphatic intermediates. These nitro compounds each possess distinct toxicological properties, metabolic pathways, and unique histories of safe application and occasional hazards. By the 19th century, production and application technologies had elevated this compound from a laboratory curiosity to an industrial raw material. Hydrosaponic acid became an industrial feedstock, serving as a plastic component for synthesizing organic compounds like acrylonitrile, whilst its cyanide salts opened vast market in metallurgy. The most historically significant technological breakthrough was undoubtedly the MacArthur Forrest's ionidation process patented in 1887. This technique enabled industrial minor-scale cyanide leaching for gold extraction from low miners-grade ores. Prospectors from the late 19th to early 20th centuries became obsessed with this new alchemy. What once deemed worthless could now generate wealth. Entire mining towns followed this promise of riches. Yet the large minor-scale industrial use of cyanide, along with the logistical challenges of transport, storage and residue disposal, later spawned another chapter. Accidents proliferate, environmental catastrophes and regulatory storm. If you draw closer to the chemical landscape, examining it through the biochemist's portable microscope, the narrative becomes both intimate and brutal. Cyanide ions harbor an extraordinary affinity for transition metals. Within mitochondria, the stage upon which every living cell breathes, the electron transport chains easily relays electrons until reaching its final gate, cycloramdeoxidase complex IV, where electrons reduce oxygen to water. This molecular gate is constructed from specialist components, ion-ion centers and copper sites meticulously arranged to direct the electron flow towards oxygen as the ultimate electron accept or unlocking life store. Cyanide behaves like a persistent pickpocket at the threshold, sneaking in to violently seize the metal centers. It forcibly binds to the ferric form of ferritin, while simultaneously interfering with copper ions to block the final electron transfer to oxygen, rendering the oxygen-reaching cells utterly futile. Even when the lungs are filled with air, cells may still suffocate. Clinical symptoms follow this logic of blockage. Cells cannot generate ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. Anaerobic metabolic alternatives can only briefly produce lactic acid. The organs with the highest metabolic demands, the brain and heart, are the first to suffer rapid damage. Inhalation of high concentration hydrogen cyanide proves fatal within minutes. Ingestion of cyanide salts is equally rapid in its lethality. The human body is not entirely defenseless. Multiple sulfotransferases, including mitochondrial sulfotransferases, can convert cyanide into significantly less toxic thiazation ions, which are subsequently excreted via urine, hemoglobin in the blood. If converted to methhemoglobin-specific oxidants, can temporarily chill its cyanide. This mechanism was later exploited by physicians in antidote therapies. Modern antidotes include sulfur-donating agents that promote bromide conversion, and hydroxycobalaminol, which directly binds with cyanide to form psychonal relation. Yet elaborating these details is not to impart knowledge of chemical warfare, but to underscore how molecular affinity simultaneously drives both harm and remedy. The behavioral characteristics of cyanide in air, water, and tissue precisely explain its unique trajectory of fate in human hands. In air, HCN permeates rooms and takes immediate effect. In solution, CN as an ion serves both as a potent nucleophile and a ligand, a veritable Swiss Army knife of organic synthesis and metallurgical processing. Within the body, HCN's volatility and peak value enable its widespread diffusion, while CN- moves like a stealthy saboteur, freely traversing cellular compartments higher than morphology and pH, while maintaining chemical inertia. It is precisely this gold minus extraction capability, the ability to capture metal ions and form complexes, that renders it utterly ruthless towards the metallic ion cells rely upon for vital energy. Thus the essence of cyanide transcends simplistic moral allegories. Stable ferrosonity complexes, such as potassium ferrosonity, serve as agricultural fertilizers or food additives at low concentrations, safely contained within protective barriers of salt-filled. Yet another form, sodium cyanide, dissolves mountains to reveal the glitter of gold nuggets. The difference lies in form, context, and intent. Science has learned to treat these distinctions with an attitude that balances caution and greed. The new pathways chemistry has opened for industry have spawned new governance regulations, operational protocols, wastewater monitoring, transportation regulation, and a new narrative for risk assessment. The scale of industrial production and application of cyanide means this molecule no longer resides solely in laboratories. It exists in rivers, tailings, reservoirs, freight wagons, and warehouses. The consequences of this transformation would ultimately extend far beyond the tannery dispute that began this tale. Yet long before industry or laboratories, humankind encountered cyanide upon the lands of cultivation and harvest. The world of plants and humans follows its own ancient chemical laws. For millennia, farmers and cooks learned to recognize bitterness and guard against certain seeds. The amygdala contained in bitter almonds, a variant of sweet almonds, is a cyanogen glucoside compound. When the cellular tissue is crushed or chewed under the action of the plant's own enzymes, it breaks down into benzolidine hydrogen cyanide. The kernel then releases the now familiar almond-like aroma. By the cooking hearth, people discovered that through specific preparation methods, desserts could retain the almond flavor without being lethal. The same chemical reaction occurs in starchy roots and tubers. Historians have bestowed upon them many names: cassava, tiruman, Ioscalanti, tamed in the Amazon basin, spread across the Americas with human migration, then sailed across oceans with European traders, finding a second home in parts of Africa and Asia. This crop is a true gift from the plant world, tolerant of poor soils and drought, providing sustenance where other crops wither. Yet its leaves and tubers harbor a chemical secret, containing cyanogen glycosides, such as linamere and unlutol in glycoside, like a trump card concealed within the tuber sleeve. When the tuber is improperly processed and ground, chewed, fermented, or left to rot, enzymes including linamarines leave the glycosides, releasing cyanohydrin or hydrogen cyanide, thus exposing the cyanide. A simple crushing action releases the gazoxone, lethal in minute quantities. For traditional communities, this has never been a secret. Amazonian peoples and African villages developed processing techniques tailored to the plant's chemistry: grinding, soaking, juicing, ferment the pulp, sun-dry, and baked. These methods transformed cyanide from a threat in staple foods into a safe ingredient. In the Americas, when making cassava bread, the bitter sap must be scraped from the root, squeezed out, and the powder dried. In West Africa, the production of gori and fufu similarly centers on fermentation and pressing. The evolution of taste and texture gradually became a cultural knowledge system. Should the taste prick the tongue like a bitter kernel, more meticulous processing becomes imperative. These practices constitute practical wisdom passed down through generations, effectively mitigating cyanide hazards during periods of social stability. Yet when societal order is disrupted by war, famine, forced migration, or economic collapse, this wisdom proves fragile. Processing steps are often simplified. When famine or time constraints compel consumption of inadequately processed cassava, public health crises ensue. 20th-century medical researchers, anthropologists, and epidemiologists documented two forms of poisoning: acute cyanide poisoning causing dizziness, severe pain, and sometimes death, and chronic neurological disease, Congo disease. This non-progressive paraplegia robs sufferers of independent mobility. When drought, conflict, or migration compels rural African communities to hastily process bitter cassava, and protein deficiency reduces sulfur containing amino acids needed for detoxification, Congo disease and other subacute cyanide poisonings emerge in medical record. This pattern is both disheartening and thought-provoking. Chemical reactions play out within social systems. Toxicity is not merely a molecular property. It is a product of logistics, labor, and poverty combined. Modern society has introduced new distortions to ancient folk chemistry. In the mid-20th century, amygdalin, derived from the same botanical knowledge, was repackaged as Letrel, marketed as an anti-cancer drug. Promoters claimed this substance, sometimes euphemistically termed vitamin B17, could selectively poison cancer cells while protecting other bodily tissues. This assertion wove laboratory anecdotes with folklore into a panacea, a promise against cancer. As modern clinical trials in pharmacology have revealed, this represented a dual misreading of biology and evidence. Trials in the United States and elsewhere found no reliable anti-cancer effects, and documented cases of cyanide poisoning linked to ingestion of Letrel or bitter almond. Since the 1972, Electrotherapy has evolved into a cultural and regulatory focal point, with border clinics in Mexico attracting large numbers of American patients, while the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and cancer institutes counter through legal and scientific means. This history serves as a cautionary tale. When confronting terminal illness, the allure of simple solutions often conceals peril. Yet within this caution lies compassion. Ethnobotanic knowledge is not superstition. It represents accumulated craftsmanship, attuned to local ecology and labor rhythm. Those who master Cospiva fermentation or bitter almond cooking technique rely on taste and manual measurement rather than instruments, adhering to safety protocols honed over centuries. Rules of survival. Modern society must not disregard folk wisdom. Yet, it has flattened and commercialized it, transforming amygdalin into a commodity bearing hope, while stripping away the social support system, ensuring its safe use. Public health implications thus emerge. Respect indigenous knowledge. Do not substitute marketing for practical testing. Ensure the distribution of knowledge and resources parallels the distribution of risks. Within these arcs, from Prussian blue to acrylic, from pigment to poison, molecular metaphors abound. Once a serendipitous beauty, then an academic enigma, then an industrial mainstay, then a secret weapon in Shima's hands. It is both coil and peril, and a vessel for societal fragility. What permeates all phones is not merely chemistry, but choice. How society chooses to address regulation, education and memory. The indigo that once warmed royal courts can within minutes silently infiltrate human lungs, becoming a chemical weapon. The irony is self-evident. Its etymology, Greek, kinoes, deep blue. Each syllable of cyanide engraves the pigment's memory. More humbling still is the tale concealed within. Such an elegant molecule could become an instrument of exploitation, to love despair. It also warns of knowledge's boundaries when practice is constrained. Close your eyes and imagine an 18th-century European laboratory. The breath exhaled during Hiller's distillation. The moment blue first appeared in Berlin's ventilated dye works, you will discover that wonder and danger, shadowing cyanide since its birth, have always intertwined at the edge of silence. In Amazonian kitchens or West African courtyards, cassava is ground beneath the scorching sun, its juice seeping into the earth. You will discover another tradition: prudence, patience, practicality. This is cyanide's dual narrative. Technology and society, chemistry embedded within custom. To truly comprehend cyanide, both facets must be considered. See how the secret of pigment triples through geopolitics. See how root chemistry evolves into public health crises. See how a minute ion focuses industrial scale, colonial trade, wartime logistics, and the silence of culinary arts. When colors named for nations give birth to molecular plagues seeping into slag heaps and assassin legends. Such absurdity carries a dry, faintly cruel smile. Yet humanity's steadfast achievements bring equal comfort. It is this very science that teaches us how to decipher the lethal mechanisms of compounds, and how to neutralize them, how to safely enter them within complexes, how to reduce cyanide levels in crops. Bitter almonds. The tale of the amygdalin and Kosovo reveals the key to risk mitigation. The techniques for reducing risk are often simple: time, fermentation, temperature, patience. Yet the application of these techniques ultimately hinges upon societal capacity and equitable justice. When these foundations crumble, chemistry reveals its true nature with nature's own ruthless indifference. Thus concludes the opening chapter of cyanide's history. This diminutive yet tenacious molecule enters the broader currents of its era, from dip patches dyes to Hiller's distillation methods, from chemical nomenclature borrowing terms from the blue spectrum, to chemical reactions unfolding in industrial furnaces and kitchen stove. Cyanide remains the tutor of contrast. Beauty may harbor peril, ancient wisdom may avert calamity, Technology can both bless mankind and threaten life. As a historian, I chronicle facts and timelines. Berlin's I Works, 1706. Schiller's distillation experiment, 1782. The 19th-century industrial revolution rendered this molecule ubiquitous. Yet, as a storyteller, I recount how mankind adorns itself in splendid robes with one hand, while administering poison with the other. Blue remains resplendent. Acidic solutions remain lethal. We have learned to coexist with both. The accident in Berlin's workshop of 1706 marks the beginning of many great industrial serendipities, when erroneous ingredients found their way into the correct vessel. Johann Jacob de Bock was dyeing leather and cloth with Cyanide madder red, when one batch stubbornly erupted in rebellious azure. This blue was neither a pale wash nor a timid tint, but a deep, almost dangerous indigo, a hue reminiscent of river depth, or the night shrouding every city. The color born in deep oxvat would ultimately reshape market dynamics and laboratory pursuit. Initially termed Berliner blue, it later gained its name, Prussian blue, a name fitting indeed. Prussia, emerging as a new power on the map, efficient and hungry for manufacturing, this pigment perfectly embodied its spirit. In Berlin workshops of the early 18th century, the air must have been thick with the pungent smell of boiled leather, the bitterness of tannin, the acrid scent of smoke, and the aroma of novel chemical cleaners. Wooden paddles clattered in iron vat, merchants counted bolts of cloth, apprentices tended the furnaces. This deep blue, unexpectedly produced where carmine red was intended, was ultimately attributed to contamination, a substance present in a supply of potassium salts. When combined with iron, occasional reddened alkaline substances formed a compound of iron and then minus mysterious blue substance. Half a century later, it was named cyanide. People became intoxicated by this hue, applying it to fabrics, painted ceilings, ship hulls and military cuffs. It was cheaper than ultramarine, which required grinding lapis lazuli at astonishing cost. This price difference proved pivotal. Painters were the first to adopt it. Its presence dominated palettes in London and Paris. Landscape artists grasped with brutal clarity how to depict the merging of sea and sky through deep, transparent washes. A century later, J.N.W. Turner and John Constable would use it to imbue the North Sea and British skies with a breath-minus-like vitality. In Japan, imported lapis lazuli redefined the world of Yokio-C. In Katsushika Hokwasi's 30-6 views of Mount Fuji, the mountain, illuminated by pigment that had crossed continents, radiated an almost electric majesty. The emergence of this pigment not only adorned canvases and wardrobes, but also posed an unavoidable question to the slowly advancing science of chemistry. What exactly was this stubborn blue? Chemists and pharmacists, amateur and professional alike, set about investigating, when countless attempts yielded only fading, pale hues. How could such a saturated and stable color be created? By the late 18th century, Swedish pharmacists extracted a faintly acidic vapor from indigo, known to others as Prussian gas. This ghostly vapor revealed the hidden chemical mystery within the pigment. 1780, Carl Wilhelm Scheele and others extracted propionic acid hydrogen cyanide from Prussian blue, bitter almonds, and fermented plants. This discovery was far from a mere academic achievement. It revealed that the pigment's color was the hallmark of a complex family of compounds. Carbon, nitrogen, iron elements danced together in an unprecedented form. When salon culture invaded the dye works, the moment craftsmen and chemists converged proved decisive. Demand for Prussian blue spurred entrepreneurs to scale up production. This once exquisite, enigmatic pigment now required production by the thousand. In larger vats, imported alkalis and stable iron sources became essential. Manufacturing plants sprang up not only in Berlin, but across Britain's textile cities and France's porcelain centres. Parisian decorators cloaked galleries and grand tapestries in blue. French tableware manufacturers discovered that when their blue rivaled costly ultramarine plates, bowls and vases sold better. Industrial chimneys rose skyward. Warehouses expanded relentlessly. This pigment proved relatively stable. Unlike certain organic dyes that faded in sunlight, it could be ground into glazes and oils for warp and weft dyeing of textiles, or mixed into paste for book printing and woodcut engraving. The demand for Prussian blue thus transformed into chemical requirements for production raw materials. Thus curiosity spawned chemistry. Chemists respawned manufacturing. This blue rendered the interdependence of craftsmanship and laboratory methods strikingly evident. It spurred figures like Jacob Boehringer not merely to name chemical substances, but to delve deeper into their very nature. The core component of Prussian blue, the Frisiane-Baird-Diol, garnered attention for its complex anionic structure, a central iron atom linked to a cage-like structure of surrounding carbon and nitrogen atoms, which themselves encircle another iron atom. When Berzelius and his peers studied these substances in the early 19th century, they confronted a concept that would render industrial chemistry possible for posterity: ligands and coordination compounds. This principle enabled sintering agents, salts and vapors, to be regarded as materials reproducible in factories. Abstract experimental exploration gave birth to practical products. Ironically, Prussian blue simultaneously retained dual attributes as both high art and base necessity. In medicine, it treated specific heavy metal poisonings in histology. It served as a contrast agent marking skin tissue. This constitutes a discrete variation in its chemical existence. Yet the very process of synthesizing Prussian blue, treating nitrogenous substances from plants and animals with potassium and iron salts, involving heating, evaporation, and crystallization, yielded by minus products chemists could not ignore. Various cyanide salts, ferrosonite and Frisiane-Baird-Diol, simpler alkaline cyanide. Thus the artisan's pigment became a gateway to the vast family of carbon-nitrogen chemistry. Once this door was open, industry relentlessly advanced. The century that began with the Dust Patch disaster would ultimately culminate in factories producing cyanides by the ton. These plants supplied raw materials to metallurgy, photography, electroplating, and other industries demanding potent reagents. The driving force remained economic gain. Inexpensive saturated blue dyes fueled the fashion industry. Yet the transformative force that truly reshaped global resource extraction was the revolutionary power of cyanide chemistry. A century and a half after the Berlin dye works incident, Scottish chemist John Stuart MacArthur, collaborating with the Forest Brothers Company, secured a patent in 1887, namely the now widely recognized MacArthur-Forest cyanide leaching process. This technology transformed geological resources into profit on an unprecedented scale. Though gold had been prized for millennia, mining had previously relied on rich veins and fortuitous discoveries. Cyanide processing changed the game entirely. It could dissolve gold from low-grade ores, rendering vast mineral deposits commercially viable, where mines once chased visible veins. Entire secondary ore bodies could now be processed. The value of an entire mountain range, suddenly calculated in dollars per ton. The chemical principle behind the process was ingenious. Too many pragmatists, almost as simple. In the presence of cyanide, gold finds it extremely difficult to exist independently. In an oxygenated environment, it forms an extremely stable soluble compound with cyanide ions AUN. When crushed or contact, aqueous solutions of soda or more potassium cyanide, gold previously bound by sulfides as silicates is liberated and subsequently precipitated. Zinc powder was commonly employed in the original method and collected. This process channels capital swiftly from rock to the treasury. The first large minor-scale applications emerged in goldfields across South Africa and Australia. Before rapidly spreading worldwide, miners faced the dilemma of scarce rich veins and vast low-grade deposits. In South African mining districts, the process perfectly suited the Witwatersrand's massive gravel deposits. Within mere years, Johannesburg transformed from a gold miners' rush settlement into a hub for capital and labor. Rail junctions and smelting works sprang up. The MacArthur Forest Act became a turning point of the century, transforming geology into modern extraction. The industry required railway lines, cyanide plants, dams and vast leaching tanks large enough to submerge entire factory buildings. Mining companies consolidated and restructured. Capital formed syndicates, capable of constructing cyanide processing plants, and acquire ore simultaneously. This method fueled speculation, where previously worthless, ultra-low-grade ore could now be hoarded, processed or bulk miners acquired. The entire socio-economic system, towns, contract networks and even international commodity markets developed around this reality that one could purchase a rock and chemically render it profitable. Behind this new logic lay hidden human and environmental costs. Cyanide's efficiency equally efficiently extinguishes lives it should never have taken. Tailings ponds, reservoirs, these damp graveyards of processed or accumulate cyanide slurry. Mines discharge chemical broths into rivers and dams, where protective measures often prove illusory. Fish populations vanish entirely. Farmland grows increasingly barren. Mining plant workers mix powders and solutions. Personal protective equipment is primitive, rudimentary, or non-existent. Though hazards were known early on, regulation remains a sham. Profit trumps prevention. The chemical industry still dictates the rules for major manufacturers. Accidents are frequent. Pipeline ruptures spew cyanide. Workers in poorly ventilated sheds inhale toxic fume. Leaks poison downstream villages. Official initial response often frames these events as unfortunate yet unavoidable. Workers receive only rudimentary antidotes, sodium nitrite and sodium thiosulfate, and are told to mind their safety. Employer liability is virtually non-existent. Even when litigation occurs, it takes decades to resolve. Social structures surrounding towns rapidly emerging around the gold industry. Migrant labor, substandard housing, racialized labor, hierarchies and colonial legacies, meaning the most vulnerable groups often bear disproportionate harm. Beyond direct risks, the ubiquity of cyanide chemistry and industry further fosters conceptual normalization. Cyanide as a standard industrial reagent, transported in bulk bags, shipped by rail, handled by thousands of workers. Chemical companies prioritized low-cost, safe production of potassium and sodium cyanides, continuously driving down expenses. To extend cyanide applications into electroplating, organic synthesis and other fields, any technology operates solely according to its designed function. Without moral judgment, its trajectory is truly determined by the socio- and political environment. And this path sometimes leads into darkness. Hydrogen cyanide's lethal properties, its volatility, rapid action, and lethal efficacy in confined spaces made it an ideal choice for applications beyond agriculture. Throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, hydrocyanic acid, known as Prussian blue acid due to its association with indigo, was widely employed as an insecticide and fumigant. The product was sold in sealed cans with warning labels. Its active ingredient was hydrogen cyanide, stabilized within a carrier. It slowly released when opened in enclosed spaces. ensuring the gas permeated cardboard boxes, bedding and crevices, for those who purchased it for its intended purpose. It was a tool for eliminating licensed rodents for others. It became an instrument of murder. In this horrifying shift of application, the technical rationale for choosing hydrogen cyanide was almost prosaic. When the gas reaches sufficient concentration in an enclosed space, it is rapidly inhaled and absorbed into the bloodstream, binding to cyclorhamopsioxidase, essential for cellular respiration, thereby severing the fundamental pathway by which the human body converts oxygen into usable energy. Death occurs swiftly at high doses. Ventilation and disperse it, being colorless and often carrying a faint scent. Some individuals may detect the smell of bitter almonds, but only a minority. This poison gas could conceal itself within the killing process. After lethal doses were released under the guise of disinfection, it could be silently withdrawn. In bureaucratic thinking, this was deemed highly efficient in the administrative lexicon of the Third Reich. It was crowned with the name Hygiene. Yet the metamorphosis of insecticide into an instrument of extermination was not achieved by science alone. It required a logistical system built upon procurement, contracts and silence. By the 1932, the Nazi regime's state apparatus, including ministries, agencies and semi-minor state enterprises, had evolved into a precision mechanism coordinating pan-European supply chains. The SS established its own economic department, equipped with procurement agents and cargo reception facilities. Chemical producers such as Degussa, Deutsch, Schadling Antelope Mining, Spingelrund, TSCHO, Stabilo and others manufactured Zyklon B. Chemical engineers managed production lines. Accountants maintained ledgers. Factory workers handled canning and labeling. Between these hands and the gas chambers lay a chain of officers who ordered palletized canning, arranged sealed wagon transport, and organized installation of heavy doors to ensure chamber airtightness. The entire process exuded a procedural absurdity. Technology originally designed for domestic hygiene and commerce was repurposed into an efficient killing apparatus, driven by foreign policy, racial ideology, and the bureaucracy's craving for controllability, found an opening in such commodities. The slaughter itself required not merely poison gas in an enclosed space, but specialist knowledge to control dosage, post-minus operation ventilation, removal of corpses, cleaning or destruction of clothing, and maintenance of the poison gas production line. This expertise stemmed primarily from industrial practice. Chemists and engineers from civilian enterprises transformed operating manuals into mass-minus production protocols. The SS mastered parameters such as the grams of hydrogen cyanide contained in canisters, the temperature of bodily fluids, the VOL ethylisation rate on mattresses, and the time required for enclosed spaces to reach lethal concentrations. They also discovered that gas efficacy was constrained by temperature. Gas diffusion slowed in cold, sealed chambers, while accelerating during warmer seasons. This death opera required technicians proficient in temperature regulation, time management, and ventilation operations. Post-war, these logistical and industrial connections could not be severed from moral culpability. Allied tribunals did not treat the development of poison gas as an abstract hazard. Instead, they adjudged participants to have knowingly and willingly conspired, based on evidence. 1946 British military tribunals tried Bruno Tesch and Kalba, associated with Tesch-Stano AG. Both were convicted for supplying Zyklon B gas to the SS. Both were executed. These trials revealed a stark truth. Chemical products openly marketed for pest control, under regime control, through collaboration between civilian and corporate sectors, could be transformed into instruments of industrialized slaughter. The trial process proved complex, as manufacturers and distributors often claimed limited knowledge of product applications, or asserted they were coerced into sales. The moral fog of wartime commerce pervaded. However, evidence of repeated direct supplies to extermination centers made arguments of pure ignorance difficult to sustain. Post-war reckoning extended beyond courtrooms into public memory and industry regulation, when the creations of engineers designing ventilation systems or chemists optimizing processes were repurposed for atrocity. How should accountability be pursued? This question sparked renewed debate on professional responsibility, corporate ethics, and the boundaries of confidentiality in wartime contracts. Nations must now consider whether legal frameworks adequately address the ethical dimensions of chemical production and distribution. Can international agreements prevent pesticide technology from being repurposed for mass extermination? The answers remain slow and incomplete. The 1925 Geneva Protocol, though prohibiting chemical weapons in warfare, could not prevent regimes from diverting legally civilian materials for genocidal crimes within their own borders. Only when new norms, new treaties, and the pressure of moral memory converged did chemical firms tighten transport protocols and governments establish oversight mechanisms for toxic commodities. Yet this history should not focus solely on assassinations, though this turning point chills the blood. The history of cyanide's legitimate and abusive use in human society contains numerous pivotal moments. Long before industrial pesticides and modern gas chambers emerged, various forms of cyanide had already become instruments of punishment in courts and prisons. Between the 19th and 20th centuries, hydrosaponic acid was the preferred lethal agent for execution. Legislative bodies and penal systems continually experimented with chemical agents in pursuit of a purportedly more humane death. For certain reformers, chemicals inducing rapid respiratory failure seemed more dignified than hanging or being dragged by a rope. In 20th century America, sealed execution chambers were occasionally filled with cyanide gas. Later, during the era of lethal injection, cyanide reappeared in the formulation of suicide pills and potions. These rapidly acting, compact compounds were carried by agents and spies, for final self-destruction should capture be imminent. During the Second World War, the British Special Operations Executive issued poison capsules as a last resort, following the same logic as those carried by escapees, requiring only one predictable chemical to be carried. Cyanide also featured on the fringes of wartime killing beyond Europe, in certain colonies and counter-insurgency operations. Each case involving cyanide and its preparations was accompanied by allegations difficult to trace. Secrecy protocols and judicial immunity made establishing conclusive evidence exceedingly challenging. Meanwhile, industrial cyanide itself remained a persistent source of accidental and even deliberate mass casualties. Mining disasters and tailings dam failures frequently discharged cyanide into rivers, causing community residents, fish populations to be wiped out, and water sources to be poisoned. The 2000 disasters in Weimar and Romania, though occurring after the core period examined in this paper, serve as cautionary echoes. When tailings dams breach, cyanide's toxicity makes no distinction between mining plant workers, residents of downstream towns, or trapped in the river. To cast cyanide purely as the villainous chemical in a moral allegory offers a narrative that is both simplistic and emotionally compelling, a tale that begins with pigments and ends with genocide. Yet historical truth is more complex. As a minotaur, cyanide's unique physical properties align precisely with humanity's multifaceted needs. In medicine, it served as an antidote to more perilous substances in artistic creation. It yielded hues that transformed how we perceive the sea in metallurgy. It transformed barren lands into sources of wealth. Yet when bloodthirsty regimes collude with profiteering industry, these properties morph into instruments of annihilation. Its developmental trajectory offers insights of strategic significance rather than moralistic admonition. Technology seldom serves a single purpose. It constitutes a network of manufacture, circulation, regulation, and application. Once technology becomes standardized, circulating in markets measured by the kilogram, defined by engineering manuals, its potential applications proliferate in ways unforeseen by its creators. Thus the blue pigment, originating from the Pueblito de los Pastores pot, replicated the fate common to pigments. It rendered chemical reactions visible to the world, subsequently harnessed by humankind. Visual delight slipped into production chemistry, then into the chemical economy of extraction, ultimately nationalist, weaponized, and repurposed in the most abhorrent manner. Art and industry, the seam between manufacture and slaughter, is not merely metaphor, but the trajectory of material practice. Raw materials, potash, barrels, railway wagons, and paperwork. At every joint, some design process flow, some sign ledgers, some formulate delivery schedules. While the world learns to cope through suffering, regulations gradually tighten. Workers' safety laws, environmental statutes on tailings ponds and chemical discharges, even international conventions banning toxic chemicals as weapons emerge, such as the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention drawing a red line, prohibiting the development, production and stockpiling of chemical agents for warfare, though it neither could nor did eliminate cyanide from legitimate pest control or industrial chemistry. It did, in the eyes of the international community, place the deliberate mass killing using chemicals like hydrogen cyanide beyond national norm. The persistence of this pigment's name carries a peculiar irony. Prussian blue. It signifies that the vitality of color far surpasses the empire that named it. Merchants, painters, and chemists, though shifting allegiances between opposing camps, shared the color market. This pigment democratized color, where artists once had only ochre and white lead for their palettes. They could now depict sea steps in the depths of night. This material democratization beautified many lives, while also revealing to the industrial world that mass-produced chemicals had become integral to infrastructure, both reagent and commodity, and production factor. Once this realization took hold, the industrial landscape underwent a transformation. Neither war, market forces, nor design could fully anticipate. History seldom follows a singular moral law. It is a rope woven from intent and accident, genius in practice and administrative oversight, beauty and horror intertwined. Prussian blue is both the poetic hue in Turner's sea steps, and the chemical compound that unlocked the world of cyanide reagents. The MacArthur Forest Act was both an invention liberating gold from rock, and an economic engine shaping urban yet barren environments. Hydrosaponic acid served as a disinfectant for ship hold, yet when perverted by the machinery of genocide, became an instrument of mass slaughter. The historian and storyteller's mission is to weave these threads into a web, until we discern how each strand pulls the next. Amidst collective complicity and technological inertia, blame should not be simplistically assigned, but rather we must perceive how mundane, trivial choices accumulate into industrial and moral consequences. Before sleep, recall one more curious anecdote. Etymology reveals the intercadecance of all things. Cyan derives from the Greek kino-s. Deep blue Prussian blue Prussica originates from Prussia. A name born in the Dachau ultimately finds its way into chemistry textbooks, mining ledgers and wartime procurement office minutes. The migration of names mirrors the pigment itself, spreading through hands, ships in the slow consumption of capital. The history of cyanide lies in the migration of factory and field laboring chemists, notes shifting from parlors to workshops and governments occasionally deploying existing technology for purposes beyond inventors' imagination. We need not conclude in despair. The practical significance of tracing this path lies in recognizing that the same organizational mindset which transformed cyanide from pigment to poison, can equally be harnessed to prevent future commodities from becoming weapons. Regulatory framework, ethical engineering education, the principle of human rights supremacy in procurement decisions. These tools prove as practical as Bohemian kilns or mineral dive adds. The indigo that once illuminated canvases may still yield marvelous hues. Chemicals that forge both wealth and death can be rigorously controlled. Isolated monitoring. Memories of past errors should not become paralyzing guilt, but transform into resilient guidance. Technology descending upon humanity can be both splendidly utilitarian and covertly lethal. This is humanity's bondage. Makers, sellers, buyers, those who turn a blind eye, collectively determine the ultimate purpose. As you lay your head to rest, remember that deep, stubborn blue frumbling. Remember how a color traces the veins of mining and atrocity. The tale is long, for its consequences span centuries. Pigment spawned chemical plants. Chemistry extracted metal from rock. Industry breeds both fortune and peril. When state and corporation priorities efficiency over humanity, ordinary commodities become extraordinary in the most abhorrent manner. Remember this chain. Only then can its recurrence be prevented. When Heinrich Himmler crushed that small object between his teeth, he displayed the same mechanical calm as in his office or the death camps. The empire's long, dreadful conspiracy culminated in a horrificously private act. This occurred on 23 May 1945, for weeks after Germany's surrender, under British custody, during imprisonment near Lemberg. This commander, who once led police and SS, this decision-maker who issued hundreds of thousands of orders before maps, had concealed a miniature capsule upon his person. He chose cyanide to end his life before any tribunal could read the ledger of his crime. 2 days earlier, another manipulator of power in Berlin suffocated beneath a bunker's heart made a starkly different choice. On 30 April 1945, Adolf Hitler orchestrated a finale combining cyanide and firearms. Eva Braun, the woman who served as companion, brief wife and accomplice in the Führer's final private theater, swallowed the prepared poison, departing with unprecedented serenity. The lens wept, yet history remained unmoved. Cyanide's role in the downfall of tyrants is no footnote, but a supremely practical element in a failed design. It lurked in the margins of wills, hidden in the pockets of fallen ministers, transformed into blueprints for poison, sealed within the metal walls of secret vials. Its allure held a brutal pragmatism for rulers who govern through violence and secrecy, establishing authority amid networks of informers and surveillance mania. The public, procedural unraveling, trials, testimonies, the scrutiny of international law, foreshadow the slow disintegration of humiliation and myth. Cyanide offers another economy of swift domination that rejects the tricks and steals the final reckoning from the state. It is an instrument for exercising autonomy at the last moment, a private counter to public humiliation. Take the case of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Once idle, his end exploited by the Nazi regime, yet became entangled in the 20 July 1940 for a plot to assassinate Hitler. On 14 October 1944, Hitler's envoy arrived at his door, when the envoy proposed a deal, in the name of mercy, offering a state funeral and family protection in exchange for silence and death. Ramley immediately swallowed cyanide and took his own life. The party line remained consistent, refusing public trial to avoid exposing backroom deals and battlefield crimes. The state permitted this field marshal to die honorably, even as truth swirled like smoke around the official narrative. Such deaths were both escape and choreography. They allowed the regime to control the final scene, confining disgrace to the private sphere, sealing away the thorny questions courts and historians would later pry open. Hermann Göring, convicted and sentenced to death by hanging at Nuremberg, ingested cyanide in October 1946, ensuring the state could not stage the final funeral. On the morning of his execution, though both his lawyer and executioner relished the tale, he placed a capsule concealed within a jar of skin cream into his mouth and crushed it. A darkly ironic twist. The man who once wielded the empire's sordid rewards found his escape from the gallows in a cosmetic container, while the world assembled at Nuremberg Palace to deliver justice. This villain, accustomed to plotting in council chambers and drawing rooms, chose to exit the stage by his own hand, though his convictions signified moral revulsion and legal clarity. His death complicated the historical ledger. The law cannot punish a man's self minus annihilation, and the finality of this self minus termination further obscures accountability in the public consciousness. These acts, Himmler's secret poisoning under British custody, Göring's last-minute triumph before the gallows, Rommel's forced departure, carry significance far beyond the specific facts. They constitute the language mastered by tyrants and puppets, a declaration extending absolute control to the very last breath. Cyanide serves as the sovereign's final instrument of proclamation, not merely a physical means, but a symbolic act, a refusal to accept the stage of trial, an attempt to preserve the false dignity of narrative, choosing silence over confession, a ritual that deprives victims of reckoning. This refusal breeds the myth of martyrdom and betrayal. Yet myths in the political marketplace are slippery objects. They can create sanctuaries where sympathy is unwarranted, and channel resentment into the vortex of conspiracy theories. But practical calculations also exist. Amid the chaotic aftermath of regime collapse, prisons overflow, trials are rushed and perfunctory, liberated zones descend into disorder. A swift chemical end often proved more attainable than the dramatic rupture of public trial. Many pills were small enough to conceal between teeth, sew into garments, mix into toiletries, accessible with mere resolve. Yet, even this convenient method remained shrouded in technical and forensic complexity, leaving courts and historians to strain over ambiguous evidence. Cyanide acts with devastating speed, inducing widespread tissue hypoxia. Its toxicity may be masked by external injuries like burn, rendering early autopsies inconclusive. The classic almond minus like odor, often alluded to in literature, proves an unreliable indicator. Most individuals cannot detect it at all. Cyanide vapors dissipate readily. Bodies poisoned thus often lack external markers. All this renders certain deaths seemingly flawless for those seeking concealment. Yet for those seeking accountability, it presents a tangled web of difficulty. The political implications of these suicides often rival the medical enigma in significance. When a figure bearing the badge of brutal authority quietly ends his life, he takes certain answers with him, while leaving behind more unresolved mysteries. His suicide may have prevented accomplices from coming forward, frozen time at a point of agony, depriving victims of the catharsis offered by testimony. The post-war world learned to guard against perfect endings. The dramatic spectacle of a capsule may conceal the multitude of hands behind the atrocities, and within this receding shadow, illusion, denial, conspiracy, the various possibilities for myth-minus making find fertile ground to flourish. Consider the relentless tide of speculation following Hitler's death. Was the body utterly incinerated? Which remains were misidentified? Could the four have escaped in some grotesque fantasy? Such doubts are often stoked by rumor and opportunism, less by forensic records than by a psychological need for closure. When closure is denied by swift, private acts, rumor finds fertile ground. Yet not all planned suicides achieve their intended ends. These tales of failure bristle with the sting of human frailty. Poison capsules rendered ineffective by damp conditions, potions that induce only convulsions after ingestion, and those who, At the final moment, recantancy cave. Failure itself breeds political drama. Captives, writhing in agony and coughing up blood, may still betray secrets once stripped of agency. For guardians of justice, such failures are providential opportunities for compilers of public narrative. They descend like curses. Scenes of dignified death are supplanted by protracted agony. The nation is forced to witness conclusions meant for private resolution. From the twilight of Tyrants, we enter the secret theatre. Cyanide's notoriety, its potency, equal to the chemical itself. Espionage has always favored tools of precision. Cyanide compact, discreet, instant resolution, a perfect fit for this aesthetic. Throughout the 20th century, the myths woven by intelligence agencies around this small capsule were as meticulously crafted as a tailor's uniform. It became a cultural relic within spy circles. More than a tool, it is an amulet, held between the teeth like a talisman against betrayal. This myth's formation stems partly from the capsule's utility to intelligence agencies, equaling that to operatives. Providing the pill to agents is both a declaration of sympathy and a symbol of control. We will never let you be broken, never let you collapse. This also represented a pragmatic risk assessment. Decisions encoded in chemical form. Though wartime reserves of cyanide were roughly documented, specific details remained shrouded in layers of secrecy. Special Operations Executive and Strategic Intelligence Service in Britain and America, German intelligence agencies, and the Soviet Ministry of State Security all had to consider the possibility of agents being captured behind enemy lines and prisoners being subjected to any means of interrogation. The calculation was simple. The intelligence held by captured agents often far outweighed the value of their lives. The capsule prevented the disclosure of secrets, such as safe house locations, radio frequencies, and contact lists under duress. Agents operating in occupied France, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe had to prepare for the worst. When intelligence agencies issued poison pills, they assumed a heavy moral responsibility, the ethical burden of authorizing death in the name of secrecy. Spy memoirs and interrogation room accounts abound with references to poison pills, capsules passed on Parisian streets, teeth embedded with miniature gold boxes, pills concealed beneath the tongue. Some of these tales are verifiable, facing resistance networks. The Gestapo New Testimony. Leaks must be stopped. British and American intelligence agencies likewise planned agents' final actions. Yet those classic images, agents clenching their teeth under interrogation lights, with black pills clamped between their tongues, represent only part of the truth. In reality, the capsules were extremely fragile and could leak during transport. Their potency diminished over time or through mishandling, and required strict storage conditions. Agents were not always trained in their youth. Panic or hesitation could lead to incomplete ingestion. Sometimes rescue arrived too late. Sometimes the pills proved utterly ineffective. Certain documented instances starkly separate romance from reality. Consider the fate of those captured agents who were offered the choice yet refused the pill, preferring to endure torture rather than betray secrets. Such resilience complicates the narrative of honor. Conversely, there were agents whose bodies remained after ingestion, creating complications for handlers, who first had to account for the agent's disappearance before proceeding. Then there are the near-minus successes. Agents who crushed the pills only experienced convulsions and were greeted by enemy medics, exposing the method's inherent unreliability. In most instances, the suicide pills fulfilled their purpose, ensuring the agent's permanent silence. Yet, at other times, they sparked fresh moral and strategic dilemmas. A deceased agent cannot be interrogated about operational breaches, nor can interrogation reconstruct lost intelligence networks. The cost-benefit analysis of this resolute method of self-domination remains far from clear. The capsule has also reshaped interrogation practices. For interrogators, the existence of suicide drugs held by prisoners presents a complex challenge, forcing them to balance exerting maximum psychological pressure with preventing the death of a living interrogation subject. This may make interrogators more cautious. In other words, less likely to precipitate outcomes they strive to avoid. Conversely, the threat or rumor of prisoner suicide may serve as psychological leverage, both inducing surrender and exempting interrogators from resorting to coercive methods. In counterintelligence operations, the knowledge that the enemy possesses cyanide constitutes a weapon in itself, employable for mockery, undermining, or justifying harsher coercive measures. Such tactics prove difficult to implement when faced with living intelligence miners holding captives. Propaganda machinery likewise exploits the poison capsule. Both state apparatuses and opposition movements shaped suicides into narratives. Suicide as cowardice. Suicide as noble resistance. In post-war trial records and the comfortable memoir market, the image of the poison capsule becomes malleable, perfectly molded to the narrator's needs. Fascist apologists may cast it as a heroic swan song. Liberal prosecutors may cite it as irrefutable proof of guilt and cowardice. Within the Soviet context, the myth of the poison capsule became woven into tales of fifth columns and treason. The Western world regarded it as a symbol of the darkest aspects of totalitarian psychology. Espionage fiction naturally gilds the capsule with splendor. Fictional brushstrokes magnify its fragility. Minuscule, jet-black, shimmering. From the instant an agent decides whether to crush the capsule, whether to resist, dramatic tension erupts. Readers are captivated by this image. A object bearing an instant life minus or minus death choice. Reality proves far less neat. The post-war era complicated moral calculations. As intelligence agencies professional as ed, debates even arose over equipping agents with capsules. Ethical questions multiplied. Entrusting others with the means of death equated to endorsing choices some abhorred. Relying on voluntary self-destruction was in truth abdicating responsibility to protect agents. Practical considerations proved equally stark. If a captured agent still held potential, and the possibility of negotiation or conversion remained, the poison capsule became a futile gesture. Intelligence agencies perpetually weighed the potential damage to their network against the irreversible loss of life. In many programs, suicide pills remained retained as an insurance measure for worst-case scenarios. In others, they were expressly prohibited. This marked an initiative to cultivate a new ethic of sacrifice, advocating resilience rather than self-destruction. The presence of cyanide in espionage has left a cultural imprint transcending the regimes that initially relied upon it, breeding a potent mythological system within the public imagination. Small, efficient, merciless. Writers and filmmakers have chewed upon this for decades. Yet for historians, the crux lies in nuance. This pill is merely one tool among many, at times effective, at times failing, ethically contentious. Its political influence is profound, shaping patterns of action, interrogation methods, and the manner states construct their narrative. These impacts often remain invisible from the outside. While the capsule became a symbol of doom for the powerful in terror in spy chambers, cyanide burst into the public sphere with a more indiscriminate brutality. This invisible death, concealed within bottles and capsules, is a horror unique to modern civilization. Available by daylight, at dusk, it may prove fatal. Two instances of the close of the 20th century fundamentally altered how consumers, regulators and journalists perceive invisible chemical threats. The mass poisoning and coerced mass suicide at Jonestown, Guyana in 1978, and the Tylenol murders in Chicago in 1982. though differing vastly in scale and motive, both centered on the same core principle. When everyday items, soft drinks and, over the counter painkillers, become contaminated with cyanide, they can become instruments of mass murder. On 18 November 1978, in the jungle settlement of Jonestown, followers of the People's Temple gathered to meet a meticulously orchestrated sequence of death. Under Jim Jones' command, over 900 people, nearly half of them children, perished through violent coercion and forced ingestion of poison. The cult's medical director concocted a beverage, widely reported to be a lethal mixture of powdered drink mix resembling a flavoring agent, cyanide, and sedative. The most unforgettable images were the neatly arranged bodies of young children, and scenes of followers compelled to submit to an ideology that had become a killing machine. Cyanide proved particularly horrifying in this context, as neither an individual choice nor an accidental poison, but a tool meticulously engineered for mass murder in collective settings. Its operational logic was chillingly simple: large containers, rapid minor-secting poison, and a leader who packaged death as salvation. The Jonestown tragedy thrust cyanide into the public consciousness, transforming it from a tool for personal release into an instrument of collective coercion. The psychological reverberations of this tragedy continue to shape American and international policy making. Yet its immediate regulatory consequences were overshadowed by an incident in the autumn of 1982, when 6 bottles of potent Tylenol capsules on a Chicago retail shelf were laced with potassium cyanide by an individual whose identity remains officially unconfirmed. 7 members of the public who ingested the poison capsules died. They were merely ordinary suburban consumers, taking medication late at night to relieve headaches. The perpetrator's motive remains an enigma. Suspicions of extortion and pranks by mentally disturbed individuals have both been posited. The public reaction was swift and intense. Humans inherently require trust. We implicitly regard the sealed packaging of pharmacies as a contract between consumers and manufacturers. When invisible toxins infiltrate ordinary packaging, this contract is torn asunder. Trust collapses in its wake. Johnson & Johnson's response to the Tylenol murders became a classic case study in crisis management. Nationwide recall of 31 million bottles. Production halted for 3 products. Full cooperation extended to law enforcement and media. This crisis accelerated the adoption of tamper-evident packaging, tamper-evident foil seal, shrink seals, adhesive-sealed boxes, and other conspicuous anti-counterfeiting measures emerged successively. In 1983, the U.S. Congress passed the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, making tampering with consumer goods a federal felony. The Tylenol murders reshaped retail standards and packaging design, with enduring consequences. A layer of plastic film and a crackling seal may be tangible. This crisis also offered insights for forensic science, as investigators accelerated development of techniques to detect trace amounts of cyanide in consumer goods, developing more efficient analytical chemistry rapid testing methods, and establishing comprehensive chain minus custody procedures for trace evidence. The Jonestown and Tylenol incidents collectively reshaped public perception. The former embedded cyanide within narratives of cult coercion, revealing how ideology can be manipulated to cause mass fatalities. The latter ingrained fears of product tampering into consumer psychology. Sociologists observed the resulting behavioral shifts. People refused to leave medicines unattended, scrutinized seals with renewed vigilance. Widespread anxiety about invisible threats began to spread. News cycles amplified this unease. Cordoned-off shop displays, investigators in white coats, images of parents emptying children's medicine cabinets. These scenes became metaphors for modern life's new fragility. People began to realize that mass-produced safety products could be weaponized by third parties. Regulatory bodies responded not only through packaging improvements, but also by establishing systemic prevention mechanisms. Poison control centers were strengthened under professionalist pharmaceutical and consumer goods industries, incorporated tamper-proofing into standard procedures. Browns-evaluated the economic value of consumer trust. The short-term costs of packaging redesign ultimately translated into long-term accumulation of reputational capital. Emergency response protocols were developed for mass poisoning incidents. Hospitals and forensic laboratories enhanced their capabilities for detecting and treating cyanide poisoning. The medical community refined detoxification protocols and emergency procedures. Law enforcement agencies formed specialist forensic chemistry teams, capable of tracing cyanide sources upstream in the supply chain. The Tylenol incident became a particularly significant training case for cross-departmental collaboration. In this era where trace contaminants made rigor immense societal consequences, public psychological perceptions of toxins transcend the realms of regulators and pathologists, becoming domains of narrative, rumor and fear. These factors do not respond purely to rational measures, when threats are both invisible and odorless. After all, not everyone can detect the bitter almond scent. Symbolic fears emerge that surpass statistical risks. The trajectory of consumer behavior post-Tylenol incident demonstrates that even when the objective probability of poisoning at a pharmacy is negligible, imagined probability distorts human conduct. Markets consequently adjust. Certain products switch from capsule to tablet packaging, as tablets are harder to covertly tamper with. Others are sold locked within cabinets. Cultural shelves overflow with new narratives, conspiracy theories, dark thriller novels and news features. They peddle fear, for fear drives sales. Policy outcomes and market reactions form only part of the narrative. These incidents also hold moral and societal revelations. In the Jonestown tragedy, the use of cyanide as a tool for mass murder forced people to confront the social conditions, enabling charismatic authority to transform devotion into fatal obedience, while the Chicago Tylenol murders revealed the fragility of everyday trust. Both incidents spurred safety upgrades in physical systems. Locks, seals, rapid detection technologies emerged in succession, yet they also expose the limits of protection. No matter how thick the packaging tape on products, social distrust can never be wholly eradicated, only managed. These events made us realize chemical threats concern not merely molecules, but systems. Who enforces, who narrates the aftermath? When we trace from the dictator's private capsule back to the lace-labeled bottle on suburban shelves, a long chain becomes clear. Cyanide's power is both physiological and psychological. It can end an empire's narrative, guard or destroy espionage secrets, and transform everyday objects into weapons against a crowded world. This chemical was conscripted into the theater of sovereignty, the theater of sovereign secrets and social panic, precisely because it is minuscule in volume, swift in effect, and crucially, imperceptible to the naked eye. This concealment has repeatedly made cyanide the tool of tyrants, spies, and perpetrators of genocide and poisoning. Upon these stages, regimes collapse into private suicides. Spies clench poison pills in darkness. Consumers poisoned by the invisible. The overarching theme is control. Who controls life? Who controls knowledge? Who controls the outcome? Cyanide offers swift and often terminal control for the tyrant. It is the final assertion of sovereignty in a world laid bare for the spy. The last line of defense, betrayal and interrogation for the mass murderer. It becomes an instrument of anonymous errand for society. It poses a thorny conundrum: how to safeguard the public sphere from invisible harm. without fortifying every sealed bottle. How to achieve protection without shutting commerce and social interaction in fear. History's answers: to establish imperfect systems, to implement imperfect remedies. Medicine and forensic chemistry enhance detection and treatment capabilities. Yet the deeper antidote lies in cultivating cultural transparency wherever possible, holding those accountable when necessary, and constructing public narratives that resist the allure of perfect conclusions. Tyrants who end lives in chemical silence must not be permitted to bury their crimes. Spies who seek solace in pills warn of the moral cost of covert warfare. Mass poisoning incidents warn the world that death technologies invariably outpace the regulations designed to contain them. Thus the story continues, slowly and inexorably, within museums and archives, in trial records and declassified documents. Minute details will coalesce into a grand panorama. The list bears the names of Himmler, Hitler, Braun, Ram L. Göring's name, and alongside them, the more nameless victims of mass poisoning, and the forgotten operatives who carried poison pills into occupied cities. The chemical itself possesses no moral imagination. It remains silent until chosen by someone. History reveals not the inevitability of cyanide, but the human choices that led to its use. Regimes preferred silence over trial. Intelligence agencies equipped agents with self-destruct devices. Assassins transformed public trust into lethal weapons. Understanding cyanide offers microscopic insight into how modern societies navigate the balance between secrecy, power, and public safety. Knight delves into these narratives not to draw conclusions, but to reveal deeper meanings. Those capsules granting tyrants final word, cast enduring shadows over subsequent institutions and narratives. They alter interrogation methods, reshape espionage techniques, revolutionize packaging and legislation, and implant within collective memory a dread of invisible intrusion. They reveal a disturbing truth. In a world woven from complex systems, the smallest object can alter countless life trajectories. This may be cyanide's final revelation to the world, though humanity would prefer its peril lacked. Such stark warning that tiny vial, concealed ampozole, and poisoned bottles all bear witness that extreme endings remain ever within reach. Society's moral imperative is to render such outcomes rare, accountable, and, where possible, utterly eradicated. In the cold, white silence of the dissection room, lights hum softly. Instruments lie dormant, a century slumber. Cyanide is a spectre that refuses to be nailed down. It leaves its mark, traces, etched in chemical shorthand upon leaves cut short, yet dissolved in death's commonplace chemical reactions. The forensic pathologist confronting the corpse faces a challenge both intimate and fleeting. Hydrogen cyanide is highly volatile. It may evaporate from the oral cavity, the stomach, the respiratory tract, may be absorbed by tissues and bind with proteins, converted by enzymes into cyanides, or masked by putrefactive changes, or neutralized by line burial, or dissipated by cremation. The post-mortem interval, that slow, inexorable clock ticking from the moment the heart ceases to beat, constantly reshapes the evidence. This poison, lethal within seconds, may not persist in the corpse for hours or days, let alone the months demanded by court-appointed experts. The forensic laboratory immediately pursues two parallel testing pathways, one pragmatic and swift, the other slow and meticulous. At the scene and in the laboratory, colorimetric field testing yields preliminary results. Immersion strips or microminus vials of reagent change color upon contact with cyanide. Test strips turn deep yellow or rust-colored. Reagent-treated swabs reveal the infamous Prussian blue. These tests are rapid, portable, and visually striking. The blue stains are sufficient to convince detective, yet they remain crude tools, susceptible to interference from environmental contaminants. metals and metabolic residues from the corpse. In forensic terminology, they are screening tools, useful, but incapable of meeting the certainty required in court. The laboratory response is more sophisticated. For the lethal volatile hydrogen cyanide gas, headspace analysis proves a crucial breakthrough. Its principle appears simple yet ingenious. Sealed sample vials containing blood, gastric contents or tissue are slowly heated. Any present hydrosaponic acid HCN migrates to the narrow headspace above the liquid surface. This minute, visible headspace can be sampled and introduced into a gas chromatography minus mass spectrometry GCMS system. By the late 20th century, the advent of compact, high minus precision GCMS system, enabling forensic chemists to capture and identify HCN with sensitivity and specificity far surpassing detection levels in the early days of poisoning. The chromator far precisely captures faint peaks at specific retention time, while the mass spectrometer provides molecular fingerprints. Gases once dissipated into the night can now be resurrected as evidence. Yet GCMS operation demands extreme caution. Sample handling must be swift, for time is the enemy. If the corpse is placed in a warm environment, hydrogen cyanide will continue to volatilize. If the body is cremated, direct evidence may vanish entirely, leaving only indirect markers. Moreover, cyanide rarely persists long in a free state within living organisms. Enzymes such as rhodanase in the liver and kidneys convert it into cyanidehistory metabolites, which circulate in the blood and are excreted in urine. Thus, detecting cyanide becomes an alternative evidence pathway. High concentrations of thiazation in blood or urine may indicate recent exposure. However, thiazation is not conclusive evidence. It may originate from other sources: dietary, plant-based cyanides, smoking, etc. Its presence must be calibrated against clinical history, expected background levels, and the timeline to capture both free and bound cyanide simultaneously. Forensic laboratories have developed total cyanide detection methods, commencing with distillation or microdiffusion. Samples must first be alkalized to prevent hydrogen cyanide loss, followed by acidification prior to distillation. Free HCN captured by the receiving solution reacts with a column minus developing reagent. The colored complex, measured spectrophotochemically, is converted into numerical data for chemists to present in court. High minus performance liquid chromatography, advancements in HLC and iron chromatography techniques enable direct separation and determination of cyanide and thiazation, eliminating variables inherent in distillation. Enzymatic assays and electrochemical detectors further diversify detection methods. Modern forensic laboratories cross-validate results through multiple complementary techniques. Even with these tools, clinicians and pathologists remain acutely aware that the narrative conveyed by chromatograms and numerical values must be interpreted within physiological context. Lethal concentrations in blood are not fixed values. The lethal range for cyanide spans from 0.5 mg per liter lower end to several milligrams upper end, depending on individual health status, history of asphyxia, location of cardiopulmonary resuscitation and sampling interval. Cyanide's lethal mechanism constitutes a molecular minus level coup. It blocks site keramoxy within the mitochondrial electron transport chain, causing aerobic respiration to collapse, forcing tissues to switch to anaerobic metabolism. The clinical echo observed globally in emergency departments is lactic acidosis. Patients' blood lactate levels often surge astonishingly above 10 mol. In victims exposed to fumes, this constitutes a subtle signal clinicians must learn to recognize. Consider cyanide, though not conclusive evidence. It forms the clinical basis for urgent intervention. The almond minus-like odor commonly associated with cyanide in popular imagination proves unreliable evidence in courtrooms and clinics alike. Only certain individuals perceive this scent, their ability determined by genetic factors, with varying prevalence across populations. Moreover, if detectable concentrations of gas are present at the scene, by the time investigators arrive, the odor has often dissipated entirely. Relying on the reliability of smell is scientifically equally suspect, yet poetically highly dramatic. The courtroom perpetually grapples with the ephemeral nature of chemical evidence. Forensic chemistry, as an emerging and dynamic discipline, has seen increasingly rigorous articulation. In the century following major poisoning trials, defense counsel routinely challenged cyanide detection results. Was the sample contaminated? Is the testing method validated? Did experts account for post-mortem redistribution? Did breaks in the chain of evidence skew results? These objections are not groundless rebuttals, but concerns at the heart of science itself. From the 1923 Frye decision in the United States, which required expert evidence to be generally accepted within the scientific community, to the 1993 Dobbs case, which mandated judges to scrutinize the relevance and reliability of methodologies. Legal standards have consistently placed the burden of proof squarely upon forensic laboratories, demanding comprehensive documentation of method, validation processes, precision, and error rate. Several landmark cases have highlighted this tension. In product alteration and mass poisoning trials, detecting cyanide in product capsules, food and blood proved decisive. In the 1980 to Tylenol murders in the Chicago area, over the counter capsules laced with potassium cyanide killed 7 people, shattering consumer trust and forcing forensic investigators into a difficult public battle over evidence. Though the perpetrator was never definitively identified, the case compelled laboratories to refine chain of custody protocol and proved complete isotopic and environmental background matching between capsules and clinical samples. The case also catalyzed public policy reform, with tamper-evident packaging becoming standard precautionary practice, whose efficacy far surpasses still imperfect detection technologies. In other criminal proceedings, cyanide's absence similarly created perplexing conundrums, such as meticulously staged suicide scenes to destroy evidence, cremation of the body, family refusal of autopsy, container discarded in river, courts occasionally convict based on circumstantial evidence, traces of the deceased's prior exposure to cyanide, witness testimony of seeing a capsule, emergency personnel observing clinical symptoms, even when laboratory test results are ambiguous. These victories, unsettling to pathologists, linger like ghosts. Forensic science pursues objectivity, yet poison leaves us with a poetry of chance. Sometimes it speaks plainly, sometimes it whispers softly, sometimes it has already vanished. These uncertainties breed conservative practice. Modern forensic laboratories employ multiple detection methods: volatiles via headspace gas chromatography minus mass spectrometry, cyanide inthiazation via high-performance liquid chromatography or ion chromatography, supplemented by colorimetry for rapid screening, rigorous sampling protocols, immediate alkalization of blood to prevent inactivation, cryoprocessed tissue, capturing volatiles in sealed vials, have become ironclad rules. In court, experts must not only report numerical values, but also elucidate metabolic pathways, exposure duration and detection limitations. Jurors seldom receive mere confirmation of toxin presence, but are guided into a narrative constructed from chemical signatures, physiological plausibility, and corroborating testimony. Cyanide stands as a delicate witness in court, vivid yet vulnerable to scrutiny. If death beds and laboratories from cyanide's dual stage, medicine constitutes another pivotal scene. It is here science becomes an improvisational craftsman of anxiety. Emergency measures for cyanide poisoning have a history far more ancient than many modern scandals. Nitrous oxide, this volatile vasodilator, once sold in small glass bottles, has long been employed on battlefields and in emergency tents. Inhaling nitrous oxide generates methhemoglobin, where its iron atom is oxidized to the trivalent state. Though still capable of oxygen transport, it readily binds with cyanide. In this context, methhemoglobin acts as a sacrificial agent. By chelating cyanide, it restores mitochondrial enzyme function. Naturally, the cost is methhemoglobin itself, which reduces oxygen delivery efficiency. This precarious equilibrium is only acceptable in critical moments when cyanide could immediately halt respiration. Through controlled administration of small doses, from the battlefield to the emergency room, clinicians systematize this approach, using ammonium nitrite in combat. Hospitals maintain a sustained methhemoglobin state via intravenous sodium nitrite, coupled with sodium thiosulate as a sulfonone. Thiosulate activates endogenous reductases to convert cyanide into thiocyanate. The compound far less toxic than cyanide and readily excreted by the kidneys. Nitrites capture cyanide bound to methhemoglobin, while thiosulate accelerates its detoxification. This combination therapy became central to cyanide antidote treatment throughout the mid-to late 20th century. This represents an ingenious biochemical solution that saved countless lives over decades. Yet all therapies have limitations. For patients already struggling with hypoxia, or perhaps due to burns and smoke inhalation from house fires, inducing methhemoglobin formation is no simple feat. Methhemoglobin exacerbates tissue hypoxia precisely during clinical resuscitation with oxygen administration. Infants and young children, individuals with G6PD deficiency and pre- existing anemia face particular danger. Worse still, when massive cyanide exposure leads to millimolar- level ion saturation of cellular targets, overwhelming all enzymatic systems. Even the combination of nitrite and thiosulate may prove too late. Clinicians grasp the brutal arithmetic of dosage and delay. Beyond the critical threshold, mitochondria sustain irreversible damage, or supportive measures fail to restore permeability promptly. Beyond conventional antidotes, alternative pharmaceuticals have been explored. Cyanocobaltate as a chelating agent reacting with cyanide to form cobalt-cyanide complexes. It is employed in critical care for severe poisoning. This potent yet non-selective agent, its side effects include hypertension and allergic reactions, rendering it a last-resort measure reserved solely for situations where clinicians deem the patient's life to be in imminent peril. This application reveals a recurring theme in cyanide treatment. The most aggressive antidotes themselves can both save lives and possess dangerous toxicity. It was not until the late 20th to early 21st century that hydroxycobalamin emerged as a gentler and more precise antidote. This vitamin B12 derivative binds with cyanide to form cyclonobination, a physiologically inert compound excreted via urine. Its mechanism of action does not rely on methhemoglobin formation, nor does it induce respiratory compensation side effects. The drug has been employed in France for decades, particularly in emergency treatment for smoke inhalation during fires. Cyanide produced by burning plastics and synthetic materials often accompanies carbon monoxide, complicating clinical presentations. Clinical practice in France and the UK confirmed hydroxycobalamil's rapid efficacy and favorable safety profile, accelerating its widespread adoption. By the mid-2000s, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved commercial hydroxycobalamil emergency kits, prompting emergency departments to integrate it into treatment protocols, particularly within burns, enters and mass casualty preparedness plans. Hydroxycobalamil is not a panacea. requiring intravenous administration in gram quantities, potentially causing transient blood pressure elevation and inducing deep red discoloration of skin and urine, interfering with certain laboratory tests. It cannot substitute fundamental interventions, such as airway management, oxygen therapy and circulatory support. In extreme exposures in areas, time remains the decisive fact. Even the optimal antidote cannot salvage brain tissue from prolonged hypoxia. The resulting clinical management protocol is both pragmatic and rigorous. Cyanide poisoning scenarios typically involve industrial exposure, smoke inhalation, deliberate ingestion, and targeted chemical attack. Clinical decisions must be made rapidly. Priorities airway and respiratory management. Immediately isolate the patient for observation and administer 100% oxygen. If medical history, environmental context, or physiological signs, severe lactic acidosis, refractory hypertension, persistent unconsciousness despite ventilation, indicates cyanide poisoning. Empirical antidote therapy is initiated. In mass exposures in areas where definitive testing is unavailable and casualties rapidly deteriorate, empirical treatment holds ethical justification. Timely antidote administration may determine survival. Here the clinician's art lies not only in chemical knowledge, but in weighing risks amidst the clamor of life minus death moments. Time and evidence. The clinical pathway from on-site inhalation to hydroxycobal and ill treatment illuminates another facet of cyanide's industrial narrative. These disasters reveal how invisible chemicals can instantly devastate ecosystems and public trust. The late January 2000 Baia spill in Romania reshaped public perception and international policy. 30 January. The tailings dam at a gold processing plant near Bay Amir breached, sending approximately 100 big meters of cyanide and heavy metal laden slurry into the Sums River. The toxic plume flowed down the Tisza into the Danube, crossing borders to cripple this century's sole lifeline for communities. Millions of fish perished. The first visible signs of damage, oily sheen stains, floating fish carcasses, and the economic collapse of fishermen and farmers rapidly escalated into a diplomatic crisis. The geographical location of the spill proved critical. The Tisza flows through Romania and Hungary before finally joining the Danube in Serbia. The Danube serves as the major artery of Central and South-Eastern Europe. As the black, toxic waters crossed borders, it exposed the fragility of transboundary river governance mechanisms. Shocked and outraged, Hungary mobilized emergency resources and demanded explanations. The fury of environmentalists and citizens is entirely justified, not merely due to ecological devastation, but because modern mining, while showcasing global capital and engineering feats, still manages to produce medieval miner-style barbaric disasters. This biological sea, instant catalyst public debate. Is cyanide leaching a method enabling efficient gold extraction by dissolving or with cyanide acceptable? Can a mine's production benefits outweigh the systemic risks it poses to water bodies and communities? The political consequences were immediate and palpable. Lawsuits and compensation claims followed in rapid succession. The Crosby investigation revealed the scale of ecological destruction. Yet neither legal action nor financial compensation can undo visible damage or rebuild trust. The industry faced a reputational crisis. Regulatory bodies began to act. Within a few short years, industry associations, international organizations and governments jointly developed a framework to prevent such disasters. The International Cyanide Management Code, formulated in the early 2000s and promulgated through the efforts of the United Nations Environment Programme and the Mining Industry Association, demonstrated ambition with humility. The code did not impose a total ban on cyanide. Instead, it required the industry to adopt stringent standards, in production, transport, and disposal of cyanide. The certification system incorporates audit mechanisms, alongside emergency response plans and public disclosure requirements. For industries reliant on cyanide's unique chemical properties, the code restricts high-risk operations while providing a viable pathway for continued use of the chemical. Technological innovation and institutional reform advance in parallel. Processes for detoxifying cyanide-rich tailings have seen optimization and scaled application of proprietary techniques such as hydrogen peroxide chemical oxidation, and proprietary techniques like the sulfur dioxide-air cyanide stripping method have been optimized and scaled for application. Tailings dam eng and nearing standards have been revised, while monitoring and early warning systems are being established. Some mining enterprises are investing in exploring alternatives to cyanide leaching by trialing sulfate leaching technology. This technique employs different chemical principles and holds promise for reducing environmental persistence. Though economic and technical trade-offs remain, remediation technologies have also advanced, with sediment removal, phytoremediation, activated carbon and ion exchange purification of contaminated water bodies, collectively form a complex toolkit. Yet reform cannot readily erase historical legacies. Cyanide, though a small molecule, proves exceptionally stubborn. It migrates, binds, and leaves toxic traces even after decomposition, penetrating sediments on food chains. Once community trusts solidifies, it requires years to rebuild. The economic, biological and political trauma cannot be reversed by certification or engineering alone. Globally, memories of such disasters keep the public and regulators vigilant. Some nations have adopted stricter measures, completely banning cyanide leaching in specific regions, raising licensing thresholds, and strengthening public consultation processes. Other countries have established safer, though not zero-risk, regulatory frameworks through industry self-regulation and technological innovation. Moreover, more insidious hidden hazards persist. Traditional and small-scale gold miners operating in remote areas often lack safety protocol. Their cyanide usage may exacerbate local exposure risks. Abandoned mine sites, tailings ponds, historical contamination from seepage and oxidation remain unresolved in many resource-poor regions, while transboundary water governance remains a diplomatic conundrum. Downstream nations find themselves powerless against upstream decisions, while remedies under international law are often slow and inadequate. In the battle against cyanide, across laboratories, clinical wards, and courtroom, three themes recur: temporality, transformability, and trade-offs. Cyanide acts with swiftness and fleeting nature. Its most acute toxicity may dissipate through biological metabolism or volatility, lies into the air before forensic experts arrive. Detection techniques have evolved to extreme sensitivity and increasing precision, yet science must always be coupled with the most rigorous protocols. Immediate sample preservation, multiple analytical techniques, supplemented by medical interventions that respect both operational urgency and intervention boundaries. Antidotes have evolved from crude methods, inducing EMIA, to more precise binding agents like hydroxycyanide. Yet the clinician's judgment regarding dosage, timing, and patient condition remains decisive. Where cyanide intersects with commercial activity, such as in precious metal mining, the erroneous societal cost compels a examination of industrial ethics. Should this chemical prove indispensable, who shall hold corporations accountable? Which technologies must be mandated? How shall affected communities secure protection and compensation? This history remains permeated by a bitter irony. This molecule, celebrated for its efficiency and immediacy, can swiftly dissolve stubborn substances, It serves as a tool for covert state diplomacy, a means for swift suicide, and the culprit behind large scale industrial hazards. It was the spy's convenient capsule, the tyrant's method of execution, the miner's solvent, the legal scholar's evidentiary conundrum. Each application spurred scientific countermeasures, detection techniques refined by courts demanding irrefutable proof, antidotes perfected by clinicians confronting dying bodies, regulations tightened as rivers turned black, and public memory remained vivid. Though the story's conclusion remains unresolved, it proves profoundly thought-provoking. Forensic chemistry and clinical medicine have learned to speak with greater caution. They have learned to anticipate the unexpected, to collaborate within the narrow, uncertain window between life and death. Industry has grasped how fragile public trust truly is. Technical solutions must be accompanied by cross-border accountability mechanism, transparency and sound governance. For communities and policymakers, the biomass spill and similar incidents reveal a simple yet stubborn truth. The benefits of specific technologies must always be weighed against their potential harm to the public good. In the opening decades of the 21st century, cyanide remains both an indispensable industrial reagent and a chemical substance demanding management with humility. The ancient fears surrounding it are both inherent to its chemical nature and the sediment of legend. They will not dissipate, nor should they, for humanity ought to respect this toxin capable of instant death, to study its mechanisms of action, to ensure its deployment invokes the highest level of caution science and law can muster. Regulators are not necessarily gentle. They descend upon the night like accountants bearing lanterns, counting what can be counted, naming what can be named. The tale of cyanide regulation begins with such an arrival, not the dramatic incursion of armed personnel, but the slow, inexorable advance of paperwork, committee documents spread across desks, maps and risk matrices. When accidents became frequent, when rivers became scapegoats, government, industry and anxious citizens began to wonder, could this chemical, used to extract metal from rock, be brought under governance, tamed, made predictable? The trigger, most point to, lies cold and grey upon a map of Central Europe. 30 January 2000. Weimar, Romania, a gold mine tailings dam collapse. Tons of cyanide-laden slurry poured into surrounding streams, forming dark, shimmering patches that moved with terrifying sluggishness along the CC, and ultimately into the Danube. For weeks, news footage repeatedly showed fish floating belly miners up, like lost coins, while fishing communities sank into silent mud. This transnational spill jolted governments into realization that water never adheres to the neat borders drawn on legal maps. Downstream, Hungary witnessed its waterways polluted. Voters seethed with anger. The international community finally turned its gaze this way. Previously, many had dismissed it as merely the negligence of a distant private mining enterprise, rather than a problem for the entire European community. The Weimar incident was not an isolated case, but the most conspicuous trigger. It crystallized existing anxieties into political capital. In the 1992's earlier, spills, occupational exposures and similar events were viewed as commercial risks, controllable, reducible, sometimes reported, or settled privately. Companies purchased insurance. Governments weighed fines against tax revenue. Communities traded jobs for tacit acceptance of hazards. With the transnational cyanide spill, that slurry of cyanide crossed 3 nations before being contained, utterly rewrote this calculus. It redefined cyanide as a global commodity, requiring international regulation. Subsequent early conferences are precisely the procedural text historians adore while novelists detest. Long tables, translators, meticulously calculated time differences, representatives from mining ministries, environmental agencies, the World Bank and scattered mining giants gather in the conference hall, even under the same roof. The contradictions inherited from the industrial age still simmer beneath the surface. On one side, engineers and executives discuss metallurgical efficiency or grades and delicate economics, making marginal deposits viable. On the other, ecologists, lawyers and leaders of affected communities debated irreversible harm to aquatic life, human rights and livelihoods. Though both sides shared the term risk, they possessed entirely different measures of patience. On the other side sat ecologists, lawyers and leaders of affected communities. They discussed irreversible damage to aquatic life, human rights, and irreversible damage to livelihoods. Both sides use identical terminology for risk, yet their tolerance levels differ vastly. This clash ultimately gave birth to a tool that, while not legally binding, carries legal weight in specific contexts: the International Cyanide Management Code, a voluntary performance standard regulating the manufacture, transport and use of cyanide in gold production. This achievement, born in the early 21st century, was a carefully negotiated compromise. It is not a globally ratified treaty, but a set of guidelines administered by a newly established multi-stakeholder body. Companies voluntarily sign up to declare compliance and undergo independent audits. Its logic possesses a compelling modernity, achieving safeguards through transparency rather than coercion, ensuring compliance via market pressures rather than protracted criminal proceedings. The code sets out a series of concrete requirements: developing robust transport plans, secure storage measures, emergency response protocols, staff training programs, and monitoring reporting systems. Companies must design tailings storage facilities with conservative safety factors, line storage ponds, restrict the use of portable containers prone to leakage during transport, and label shipments indicating their hazard level. The code further emphasizes the necessity of independent, third-party audits, proactive publication of audit findings, and fulfilling obligations to engage with local communities. In short, the guidelines aim to bring the private risk calculations between directors and insurers into the open, before the public, shareholders and the law. This transparency has brought about substantive change. Mines adopting the guidelines have installed thickened clay or geobermal liners in tailings ponds, laid multiple redundant pipelines rather than single line networks in unstable geological areas, mandated the use of tamper-proof sealed transport containers, and implemented hazardous materials handling training for drivers. Emergency response plans have evolved from a few handwritten telephone numbers on a notice board to comprehensive drills involving local hospitals, fire services and water authorities. Some enterprises employ chemical processes to implement cyanide detoxification systems on mine site, ensuring residual cyanide is thoroughly removed before wastewater discharge. Others convert ponds into engineered systems, minimizing harm to wildlife. Countries adopting the code gain reputational advantages, and increasingly gaining access to investment and insurance channels. The adoption of these guidelines has been particularly rapid. International lenders and insurers have made compliance a condition of financing. The market votes with its capital. However, the voluntary nature of the guidelines also constitutes a structural weakness. Voluntary mechanisms tend to attract only willing participants. They prove least effective in regions with weak governance, and the greatest incentive, where permits can be obtained through political connections. Penalties for violations are negligible or difficult to enforce. Enterprises may treat the guidelines as guidance rather than gospel. The depth of auditing depends on the integrity of evidence, while auditors themselves are not immune to conflicts of interest. After all, the auditing industry, as a professional ecosystem, possesses its inherent incentive mechanisms. Certain enterprises, to secure contracts or investments, deliberately downplay historical liabilities or promise illusory remediation plans. This constitutes the tick-box problem, where compliance becomes a formality rather than substance. Documents may appear flawless, funds may be lined on paper, yet leaks will still occur. Beyond voluntary measures, some national legislatures have indeed enacted laws. Hungary, for instance, tightened restrictions following public outrage after the 2000 disaster. Alarmed and mobilist Eastern European publics have driven stricter regulation. Governments elsewhere have implemented more rigorous hazardous goods transport regimes. Europe has strengthened enforcement of the European Agreement concerning the international carriage of dangerous goods by road. ADR. Canada, Australia and the United States have enhanced port controls based on the International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code, IMDG Code. Long-standing experience in the mining sector has fostered a patchwork system of federal and provincial regulations. This creates overlapping oversight with international rules. Employer liability scheme. OSHA's exposure limits and environmental protection regulations mandate accident reporting. Worker training. In certain circumstances, remediation funds must also be established. Yet regulations and guidelines similarly present loopholes. Unequal enforcement of safety regulations remains a constant feature of industrial modernity. The second implicit limitation of regulatory shifts lies at the cognitive level. Cyanide is readily quantifiable, measured in parts per million and expressed as a single numerical value. This approach is natural. However, the chemical properties of cyanide, its various salts, its free and complex states, and their capacity to form secondary pollutants, defies amplification. Regulations setting thresholds for free cyanide may overlook the release of complex cyanides. Under varying pH conditions, paper-based isolation requirements become meaningless when confronted with geological conditions like fault seepage. Regulations may mandate monitoring, but monitoring is performed by people, often those stakeholders least inclined to uncover problems. Too many. The tension between regulatory rigor and chemical complexity lies precisely where danger lurks, not to mention political factors. The political economy of gold, regional development, protection networks, national balance sheets, and other considerations often cause risk discourse to yield to employment discourse. Mining companies convincingly argue that cyanide extraction is the only economically viable method for most deposits, whilst governments, particularly in resource-dependent regions, tend to grant approvals when promised employment and infrastructure. This guideline seeks to alter such transactions by increasing the social cost of non-miners compliance and establishing reputational penalties. Yet in towns where mining may be the sole economic pillar, reputation sometimes holds far less sway than paychecks. Thus social license to operate remains elusive, demanding negotiation, mine by mine, community by community. If the regulatory narrative is one of audit and constraint, then the cultural narrative runs parallel, tracing how a chemical substance acquires specific connotations in the public imagination. Cyanide, despite its complex chemical properties, carries an image that is starkly simple. It transforms in an instant, harbors hidden depths. Its lethality is aristocratic in its nobility, swift and private. The image of that crushed microcapsule resonates so deeply, lies partly in its ability to pierce complexity and strike at the heart of drama. Cold War spies would swallow capsules rather than face interrogation. Neue characters, after sipping seemingly innocuous drink, suddenly grow common silent. Tabloid headlines relish such dramatic twists. The bitter almond scent, the notion that cyanide emits an almond-like odor, stands as a paradigm of cultural memory, unforgettable, richly suggestive, and more accurate in myth than in reality. After all, olfactory recognition varies genetically and is unreliable as forensic evidence. Fiction draws inspiration from reality, yet also feeds back into it. During the Second World War, British and American spy novels frequently employed cyanide as a shorthand symbol, both rooted in wartime experience and inherited from the spy imagination. Ian Fleming's spy universe, though famed for firearms and martinis, also elevated chemical agents to decisive prop. John le Carre, with quieter, more sombre strokes, molded poison into moral symbols and discreet bureaucratic tools within state intrigue, rather than dazzling instruments of death. Cinema amplified this imagery, with abrupt cuts to slender vials, an elegant woman unscrews a lipstick tube to reveal a cyanide capsule, blurring the line between allure and annihilation. Film noir cloaks cyanide in melancholic aura, men glimpsing destruction through cigarette holders, women who would rather die than yield. This aesthetic effect is undeniable. Within cultural context, cyanide functions like a final full stop, yet more unsettling and profoundly influential is another layer of cultural symbolism: political assassination. Cyanide's portability and lethality make it the ideal instrument for covert violence. Authoritarian regimes and intelligence agencies discovered cyanide could eliminate opponents through plausible deniability or sudden termination. Historical archives brim with cases of dissidents and suspected traitors meeting their end via cyanide or its derivative. Sometimes it was a hasty local operation. Other times it formed part of a transnational suppression campaign. The myth of the capsule, discreet, instant, private, perfectly suited to the secret agent's need for control over the termination process. A clean, efficient narrative with few witnesses. Yet the deeper, darker cultural resonance stems from an even more distant past: the application of hydrogen cyanide in mass extermination. Nazi Germany transformed the cyanide fumigate, Zyklon B, into an industrialized instrument of death, the most harrowing chapter in the cultural history of this chemical. Those gas chambers converted a commercial fumigant into an instrument of genocide. The innocuous technical terminology of pest fumigation became vocabulary of death. This historical fact has persistently haunted public discourse, rendering cyanide not merely a symbol of private suicide or espionage, but also a vessel for the memory of state violence. This association carries moral weight and political consequences, making any policy discussion concerning cyanide profoundly heavy. As if the molecules themselves were steeped in historical dread, the public imagination's craving for drama often overrides toxicological reality. In fictional work, cyanide delivers instant lethality. On the silver screen, a single drink signifies a clean, cinematic death. Yet in laboratories and hospitals, toxicologists recount a starkly different narrative: complex, contingent, at times agonizing slow. The speed of cyanide minus induced death hinges upon dosage, form route of exposure and the victim's physiological state. High minus concentration hydrogen cyanide gas can prove rapidly fatal. Ingestion of certain salts may rigorous low onset, as tissue hypoxia triggers cascading symptoms. Existing medical interventions can alleviate symptoms. Antidotes such as nitrosamines, sodium nitrite, and sodium thiosulfate, if administered promptly, can mitigate toxicity. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy and supportive care prove effective in intensive care settings. Yet timely access to medical assistance is far from guaranteed. The concise narrative of fiction obscures the chaotic reality experienced by poisoning victims. Emergency calls, ambiguous symptoms, misdiagnosis, and the enduring neurological damage endured by some survivors. Historians and toxicologists thus favored clinical case studies to puncture a romanticized narrative, emphasizing cyanide's lethality is not nuclear minus blast instantaneous, but a process of cumulative probability. Thus cultural and regulatory contexts begin to intertwine. Public anxiety shapes policy choices. Media and literary depictions of immediate poisoning fuel political pressure. The bio-rom leak was both an environmental catastrophe and an aesthetic scandal. The imagery provoked public outrage. The Romania-Russia-Montana project, proposed by Canada's Gabriel Resources in the late 2000s, sparked nationwide protests in 2018, becoming a classic case of mobilizing cultural memory around cyanide. Thousands of Romanians took to the streets, not merely to protect water sources, but also to resist the toxicity symbolized by this industrial minor-scale cyanide mining project imposed upon a historic landscape. Protesters' slogans posed moral arithmetic: water security versus gold, uncertain promise. This movement successfully embedded anti-cyanide sentiment within public policy debates. Yet it also revealed how regulatory frameworks can be subverted by democratic mobilization, raising questions about the ethical ledgers society must maintain. Cyanide's evolution from peculiar laboratory reagent to pigment raw material, to industrial tool, and even instrument of murder and state repression, compels society to confront thorny questions about scientific accountability and corporate governance boundaries. When rivers are poisoned, who bears responsibility, and who undertakes remediation? When multinationals establish processing plants beside impoverished villages, who are the true stakeholders? These are not merely legal matters, but moral propositions concerning the distribution of risks and benefits across temporal dimensions and social strata. Lessons begin with the simple practice of transparency and participation. Regulators recognize that technical fixes can never replace democratic oversight. Even the most meticulously designed tailings ponds may be demonized by unconsulted communities or underfunded regulators. Despite its flaws, the International Cyanide Management Code pioneered exemplary models for third-party verification and community engagement. The code's audits and public reporting provide local activists with the language and documentation to challenge corporate claims. This is crucial, as it undermines the credibility of corporations promising development while refusing accountability. It refocuses public scrutiny on contentious issues. Technological innovation offers further insights and hope. The industry has continuously refined cyanide management techniques over decades. The ENCO process, an alkaline chlorinated method for cyanide destruction, represents one such chemical solution. Technologies like sulfide oxidation and enzyme-based bioreactors are also advancing. Biological degradation techniques, utilizing bacteria and fungi to metabolize cyanide into harmless compounds, have progressed from laboratory research to practical applications in mining areas. Tailings reprocessing technology has evolved beyond mere resource recovery to become a means of extracting metals, while mitigating historical liabilities by removing cyanide from legacy waste. Continuous monitoring technology advances persistently, with real -time sensors and remote telemetry and drone-assisted detection, making leaks harder to conceal, and responses more rapid. Increasingly widespread satellite remote sensing reveals subtle changes in terrain and water bodies previously undetectable. Whilst these technologies cannot absolve moral responsibility, transparent deployment and local community engagement can reduce incident frequency and severity. Research literature on cyanide alternatives continues to expand. Thiazolate-off leaching employs relatively mild thiazolate-off solutions to extract gold from specific ores. Pilot projects have commenced on refractory ores where cyanide processing proves particularly challenging. Glycine leaching systems and novel chloride chemistry processes have demonstrated potential in both laboratory and pilot stages. None of these alternatives represent a universal panacea. Chemical and geological characteristics exhibit profound inherent variability, yet the very existence of alternatives is driving the evolution of the mining industry's ethical and economic framework. where cyanide is not absolutely essential for specific deposits. Its use should be subject to heightened thresholds, even as technologies and alternatives emerge. Legal and ethical frameworks must evolve in tandem. The challenge lies in designing systems that are both technically rigorous and politically viable. This entails adequately funding regulatory bodies to shield them from influence by vested interests, establishing liability regimes that internalize costs, and establishing financial guarantees that genuinely cover long-term remediation while strengthening international cooperation. To prevent transboundary rivers from becoming governance vacuums, where pollutants are dumped and checked, international or financial institutions must also play their part by linking laws to robust environmental safeguards and genuine community consent. Memory demands we remember the victim, whose human stories are often obscured by the cultural aura of cyanide, obscuring the human stories behind policy debates. The deadly waters faced by biome fishermen at dawn, communities by tailings ponds whose livelihoods and sense of belonging eroded, vanished, political dissidents, in industrial environments. Commemoration proves especially arduous. The deceased may not be visible. Harm often accumulates slowly, yet public remembrance, whether through plaques, community museums, or oral history projects, holds profound significance. It shifts the discourse from technical audits to moral reckoning, demanding that the ledger of industrial progress must account for human lives and ecosystem. The ultimate lesson remains incomplete. Cyanide will not vanish overnight for industry, just as steel will not cease being a building block. The historical trajectory of this chemical reveals a pattern. Technology creates possibilities. Industry achieves scale. Public outrage or tragedy spurs regulation. Technology adapts accordingly, while culture ensures memory endures. Each juncture presents an opportunity to tip the scales towards life and ecology. Coding is the force of incarnation. Grassroots watchdog activists are the force. Scientists pushing alternatives from laboratories to fields are the force. Regulators diligently performing their duties in the dead of night are the force. Communities refusing to accept water resources as expendable are the force. Ultimately, we invariably fantasize about ultimate solutions, perfectly sealed, global bans or single-minded technology panaceas. Yet history proves both cruel and wiser. Reality is intrinsically layered. Superior design, relentless oversight, genuine public engagement, and resolute innovation to proactively mitigate risks. Future holds more conferences and committees, new sensor suites, and upgraded dye contamination system, fresh litigation, and community campaigns. Cyanide will forever maintain its dual existence. Industrial utility, health hazard, metaphorical vessel. Its historical legacy is a call to vigilance. When you ponder cyanide in the dead of night, when history and fairy tales intertwine, imagine not only capsules and cigarettes, but the lengthy chain of decisions behind every gram. Picture engineers calculating line of thickness, truck drivers undergoing hazardous materials training, auditors reviewing files in cramped offices, fishermen recounting to grandchildren tales of rivers flowing as dark as ink. Picture 2013 Bucharest streets, protesters holding placards, their words solemn and potent as manifestos. Water is mightier than gold. Then envision researchers in laboratories, steeped in solvent vapors and coffee scents, attempting to coax microbes into consuming cyanide, as if taming a tiny, beneficial beast. History's slumber is never tranquil. Tossed between neglect and reform, it finds no rest, yet solid remains, in rigorous oversight, moral pressure, emerging science, and a public refusing passive acceptance, ultimately reshaping perilous commodities' fate. Cyanide's history reveals technology is not neutral. It will ultimately take the form we bestow upon it. This is both a weighty warning and a silent hope. When humanity learns to value rivers and reputation equally, tools like cyanide that bind wealth to risk will find their future governed not solely by profit margins, but by humanity's cautious and deliberate cultivation.